Various imperial officials, knowing full well that Ambrose could put a stop to it all if he wanted to, came around to broker a deal, but the bishop refused to compromise. Eventually, with a hostile mob overwhelming the outnumbered imperial troops, Justina relented and ordered her men to withdraw. The Bishop of Milan had just stared down the Empress and won. I imagine that his success on that day bolstered his confidence to the point that when the time came, he felt no fear about getting into a staring contest with an emperor. And not a boy emperor like Valentinian II or a malleable young emperor like Gratian, but a fully established soldier emperor like Theodosius, who had just won a civil war, making him the last sole ruler of the Roman Empire. There is a Spanish word for what Ambrose had, and that word is cojones. While these religious controversies swirled, the three imperial centers of the empire continued to maneuver around one another politically. Maximus kept working toward full recognition. Valentinian II, or at least the high officials of his court, kept working to maintain their independence in the face not only of the threat posed by Maximus in the north, but also the threat by Theodosius. At any moment, the Eastern Augustus might decide to step in and declare himself the protector of Valentinian II, which would be nothing more than a polite way of saying that Valentinian's days as an independent emperor were over. In the East, meanwhile, Theodosius kept working methodically to ensure the stability and safety of his provinces so that he could go face down Maximus properly. He had not yet answered definitively the question of recognition of Maximus or civil war with Maximus, but it was pretty clear that he wanted civil war with Maximus. In 386, though, Maximus' ignition was raised by the appearance on the north bank of the Danube of an armed force of Greuthungi Goths. In a scene eerily reminiscent of the events of 376, the Greuthungi were demanding that they be allowed to settle in Roman territory, just as their cousins had been allowed to settle a few years before. With said cousins already causing formidable administrative and security headaches for Theodosius, though, the thought of even more Goths settling in the empire drove the emperor to fits. He was over dealing with Goths. So completely over the Goths. And so he came up with a rather brutal solution. The Greuthungi petitioners were told that they would indeed be allowed to settle in the empire. But once they were in their rafts and crossing over the river, surprise, the imperial fleet manning the Danube suddenly attacked. The Goths were surrounded and then slaughtered. So completely over dealing with Goths. In 387, Maximus's hope for recognition was dashed for good, when Roman ambassadors returned from a final round of talks with the Sassanids, treaty in hand. I haven't been able to find a good way to slip this bit in yet, so I'm just going to sort of wedge it in right now. But the Persian king the Roman ambassadors dealt with now was Shapur III, rather than that old, implacable enemy of the Romans, Shapur II. Sadly, Shapur the Great finally died in 379 AD, after a remarkable 70-year reign over his empire, which you'd think would be some kind of record. But history is apparently full of monarchs who reigned for 70-plus years, Louis XIV and his 72 years running France among them. The record for longest verified reign, because I know you're just dying for me to tell you this, goes to Sobhuza II, King of Swaziland, who reigned 82 years, 254 days between 1899 and 1982. The record for longest unverified reign goes to the Egyptian Pepi II, an Old Kingdom pharaoh who reigned 94 years between 2278 and 2184 BC. Good job, guys. Anyway, I note the passing of Shapur II because, man, that guy has been an on-again, off-again boogeyman of the Romans since he was first provoked by Constantine the Great way back in 336. he rightfully deserves his place in the pantheon of all-time great enemies of the Roman Empire, and may he rest in peace. So the ambassadors returned with a bad deal for Rome, but a good deal for Theodosius right at that moment. The Romans agreed to cede 4/5 of Armenia to Sassanid control in exchange for peace. The deal may have been a crappy one, but it gave Theodosius the peace he wanted, and it broke the imperial stalemate that had defined the empire for 5 years. Theodosius was now free to move on Maximus, and everyone knew it, which changed the whole equation. As soon as he found out about the deal, Maximus knew he could no longer afford to sit back and hope for a peaceful resolution. So, near the end of 387, he mobilized his forces and drove them south into Italy, blowing through the garrisons protecting the Alpine passes. Valentinian's advisors determined that Maximus's army was too strong and coming too fast for them to fight back, so they packed up and fled for the protection of Theodosius's court. There was still a lingering fear that Theodosius might take this opportunity to essentially depose young Valentinian, but that was a risk they were going to have to take. Next week, we will see that their fears were misguided. Far from wanting to depose Valentinian, Theodosius will demand that the two emperors be bound together even closer than ever. Yes, Theodosius had his eye on the next generation and wanted to ensure a clear path for his own sons to inherit the empire. But for now, he really would be the protector that Valentinian needed. Right now, it was time for war with Maximus. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 157, Only the Penitent Man Shall Pass. In late 387 AD, the 12-year-old Emperor Valentinian II, his mother Justina, and the rest of the Milan court showed up in Thessalonica begging Theodosius for asylum. The Eastern Augustus, aware that his brother emperor had been put to flight by the usurper Maximus, had traveled down to the port city in advance and received the exiled court with open arms, promising to do everything he could to restore Valentinian to power. But not just out of the goodness of his heart. The price for Theodosius's help was the hand of Valentinian's sister Galla in marriage. The Eastern Augustus's first wife Aelia Flaccilla, mother of the two future emperors Arcadius and Honorius, had died in 385, and Theodosius was looking for a marital alliance that would bind his clan to the Valentinians, forming a single intertwined dynasty. The price seemed reasonable enough to the Empress Justina, and the marriage was hastily arranged. Emerging from the wedding ceremony as a single political unit, the Theodosian-Valentinian dynasty then prepared for war. Maximus had timed his attack on Italy perfectly, waiting until the last minute before winter set in to pounce. By the time Theodosius learned of the attack, it was too late in the year for the Eastern Augustus. He would have to wait until spring, which meant that Maximus had bought himself 6 months to get his house in order and ready his troops for an inevitable counterattack. The general had already laid the groundwork for defending Italy during his initial invasion, as it is assumed that bribery and induced defections had been the main reason he had penetrated the Alpine passes so easily. When these Italian forces were combined with his Gallic legions, Maximus's army was, at least on paper, equal to just about anything Theodosius would be able to put in the field. After all, we are still just a few years removed from the devastating Gothic War. It's not like the legions of the Middle Empire had a lot of men to spare for a civil war. But Theodosius had been laying some groundwork of his own. We saw last week how the peace treaty with the Sassanids freed up at least some Syrian border troops for the campaign. But the Eastern Augustus's main source of recruits for the coming civil war would actually come from the ranks of the very barbarians he had spent his first few years in office fighting. In these turbulent times, alliances were formed, broken, and reformed with dizzying speed. Theodosius had not stopped working after successfully bringing an end to the Gothic War with a combination of attrition and diplomacy, and throughout the mid-380s he continued to focus his attention on winning over as many barbarians as he possibly could to his side. And that did not just mean Goths. That meant factions of Huns and Alans from beyond the Danube frontier who were more than willing to sell their cavalries into imperial service, if the price was right. Nothing about the armed conflicts of late antiquity make them easy to paint in stark black and white terms, and the war that is about to break out between Theodosius and Maximus is a great example of why it's so hard. Theodosius's top field generals, Ricomeres, the general who had come east at the outset of the Gothic War, and Ricomeres' nephew Arbogast, were both ethnic Franks from the Lower Rhine. They would be leading a mixed band of Roman legionaries drawn from the Danube provinces, Gothic auxiliaries called up according to the terms of their settlement agreement, and Hun and Alan mercenaries, who were paid to serve as Theodosius's cavalry army. They would be fighting against Maximus, who hailed from the same region of Spain as Theodosius, but whose army consisted mostly of Gallic legionaries, who were basically just ethnic Germans living on the west side of the Rhine, and Alemanni auxiliaries, who answered Maximus's call to arms after years of friendly patronage from the general. In other words, when looked at from a few miles up, this Roman civil war resembles nothing so much as a giant squabble between rival barbarian tribes. Take out Maximus and Theodosius, and really, how many Romans in this Roman civil war are left? Not many, I can tell you that. When spring came, Theodosius went on the offensive and ordered a two-pronged assault on the Italian peninsula. Ground forces would march west through the Alps, while a naval force would simultaneously sail up the Adriatic and attack by sea. Maximus, using Aquileia as his base of operations, worked quickly to counter both threats, pulling a force down to deal with the naval invasion, while directing the bulk of his forces to block up the mountain passes. But unfortunately for Maximus, the winter had worked both ways, and he too had been forced to wait until spring to make many of these moves. So, when an advance guard of his army occupied the small city of Siscia in what is now Slovenia, they were unable to complete the defensive fortifications necessary to hold Theodosius off. With the lightning-fast Hun cavalry leading the way, Theodosius's land army made contact with Maximus's forces at Siscia and easily ran them off. But this was just the opening skirmish. The real test would come 100 miles to the north, in the fortified city of Poetovio, where Maximus's main army, led in person by his brother, was stationed. Details are scarce, but it appears the two sides met in battle in midsummer 388, and after an intensely fought back-and-forth battle, Theodosius emerged victorious. With his armies guarding the mountains defeated, and his southern flank failing in the face of the naval assault, Maximus called for reinforcements from the north, and then fled back to Aquileia to await relief. But with Theodosius